You can feel the shift in your chest when you finally stopped explaining yourself, stopped justifying your needs, stopped using careful diplomatic language designed not to trigger their defenses. You just started saying what was true in sentences so simple a child could understand them, and something changed. Not in them, not immediately, but in the dynamic, in the space between you, in the way they suddenly started paying attention in ways they never did, when you were being accommodating and patient and endlessly understanding. I need consistency, or I'm leaving. Not, I feel like maybe we could work on being a little more consistent, because I sometimes feel uncertain, and that's hard for me. And I know you're dealing with a lot, but just the clean, simple truth delivered without apology or cushioning or room for negotiation. And here's what you need to understand about what happened in that moment. You accidentally triggered their addiction mechanism, because avoidants don't get addicted to people who are endlessly available and understanding. They get addicted to people who communicate with such clean, unambiguous clarity that the avoidance nervous system cannot misinterpret, cannot manipulate, cannot create the usual wiggle room their defenses depend on. The communication style that makes avoidance addicted isn't the soft, empathic understanding everyone tells you to use with wounded people. It's the opposite. It's communication so direct, it leaves zero space for defensive interpretation. So boundaried, it makes non-compliance produce immediate visible consequence. So clear about what you need and what happens if you don't get it, that the avoidant finally understands the stakes in ways their defended psychology cannot deny or minimize or rationalize away. This communication style is rare enough that when avoidant encounters it, their entire system gets rewired around wanting access to person who communicates this way. Not because it feels comfortable, it doesn't. Because it feels real. Because it cuts through the defended fog they live in. Because it's the only communication style that reaches the part of them that's been waiting their entire life for someone to be clear enough that they can't hide behind their patterns anymore. The 3 specific communication patterns that trigger the avoidance addiction response. The avoidance addiction isn't to personality type or to specific behaviors. It's to communication patterns that create psychological states their defended system both fears and desperately needs. Understanding these patterns helps you see why certain ways of speaking create the addiction response. They get addicted to communication that's direct without being aggressive, stating needs clearly without emotional charge that triggers their defenses while making non-compliance uncomfortable. The communication that hooks them isn't soft, isn't diplomatic, isn't cushioned with qualifiers and apologies, but it also isn't aggressive, isn't attacking, isn't delivered with emotional intensity that lets them dismiss it as you, being too emotional or overreacting. It's clean, direct, emotionally neutral in delivery, but absolutely clear in content. I need you to communicate when you're withdrawing instead of disappearing. If you can't do that, I can't continue this relationship. That's the pattern. No anger, no pleading, no emotional manipulation, just clear statement of need, plus clear statement of consequence if need isn't met. This combination is addictive to avoidant because their defenses are built to handle 2 things. They can dismiss aggressive communication as you being too much, and they can ignore soft diplomatic communication as not serious enough to require response. But communication that's direct without being aggressive cuts through both defensive strategies. It's not dismissible as overreaction because there's no emotional charge to dismiss. It's not ignorable as non-serious because the boundary and consequence are stated clearly. The avoidance system has no defense against this pattern, and encountering communication they can't defend against creates addiction because it reaches the part of them that's been hiding behind defenses, the part that desperately wants someone to be clear enough that hiding becomes impossible. They get addicted to people who state boundaries as facts rather than requests, not asking for compliance but informing what will happen if boundary is crossed. Most people communicate boundaries as requests. Could you please not withdraw without telling me? I'd really appreciate it if you could be more available. It would mean a lot if you could work on being more present. These requests give avoidant room to say no, to partially comply, to negotiate terms. Requests preserve their control, but the communication that creates addiction doesn't request. It informs. I don't stay in relationships where someone withdraws without communication. This is information about me, not request for you to change. If this pattern continues, I'll leave. That's the shift. From request to information, from asking them to comply, to informing them what you do and don't accept in relationships you remain in. This shift is addictive because it removes their control over whether to comply. They can choose to meet the boundary or not meet it. But they can't negotiate the boundary, can't partially comply, can't maintain the pattern while keeping you because you've stated clear fact. This pattern and your presence cannot coexist. The addiction comes from encountering someone whose boundaries aren't negotiable, which means the avoidant has to make actual choice, change the pattern, or lose the person, rather than managing to keep person while maintaining pattern through partial compliance or promises of future change. Choice is terrifying. Choice is also what reaches their real self beneath their defenses. And reaching their real self is what creates the addiction. They get addicted to communication that follows through immediately when boundaries are crossed. Words matching actions so perfectly, their pattern testing fails to find gap. Avoidants test, constantly, unconsciously. They test whether your boundaries are real by crossing them slightly to see if you enforce consequences you stated. Most people don't enforce immediately. They give more chances. Explain the boundary again. Communicate hurt the boundary crossing caused. This gap between stated boundary and enforced consequence teaches avoidant the boundary isn't real. It's request they can violate without losing you. But communication that creates addiction has zero gap. I said, I need communication before you withdraw. You withdrew without communicating. I'm leaving for 3 days. We can talk when I return if you're ready to address this pattern seriously. The consequence arrives immediately, not as punishment, as enforcement of stated boundary. No explaining, no processing feelings about it, just clean enforcement that proves words match actions perfectly. This immediate follow-through is addictive because it's the only thing that teaches avoidance nervous system that this person is different, that testing won't work, that boundaries are real, and violation produces stated consequence without negotiation or delay. The addiction develops because their entire defensive system is built on assumption that they can test boundaries and find room to maintain patterns. Finding someone who can't be tested, whose boundaries are enforced immediately and exactly as stated, is encountering immovable object their defensive patterns cannot move. And immovable objects are addictive to people who've spent life moving everyone else. How this communication style reaches the part of them their defenses have been protecting. The reason this communication creates addiction rather than driving avoidant away is because it bypasses their defended system and speaks directly to the wounded self that's been waiting for someone to be clear enough and strong enough to reach them. The clarity cuts through the defended fog they live in, creating moments where they can't hide from reality of their patterns or consequences. Avoidants live in defended fog. Their patterns are invisible to them or minimized or rationalized as necessary self-protection. The consequences of patterns are diffuse enough they can avoid confronting them directly. This fog is protective. It lets them maintain patterns without feeling full weight of what patterns create. But communication that's clean and direct and boundaried creates clarity that cuts through fog. Your withdrawal pattern is destroying our relationship. You're doing it right now. If it continues past this week, I'm gone. There's no fog in that statement, no ambiguity, no room for rationalization. The pattern is named, the consequence is stated, the timeline is clear. In that clarity, they can't hide from what they're doing or what it's costing. The fog lifts for a moment, and they see themselves and their patterns clearly, without defensive distortion. These moments of clarity are terrifying, but they're also addictive, because underneath the defended fog is a person who's been waiting to be seen clearly, to see themselves clearly, to have someone be clear enough with them that pretending becomes impossible. The addiction is to the clarity itself, to experiencing moments where they can't hide, which paradoxically feels more real and more alive than the defended fog they normally live in feels. The boundaries force them to make real choices instead of maintaining ambiguity their defenses depend on. Avoidant defenses depend on ambiguity. On keeping things unclear enough, they never have to make definitive choice. They can be sort of in relationship while sort of maintaining defended distance. Can be sort of available while sort of withdrawn. Can sort of care while sort of protecting themselves from caring too much. Ambiguity lets them avoid choice. But communication that creates addiction eliminates ambiguity. Either you're in this relationship, and that means showing up consistently, or you're out. There's no middle. Decide by Friday. The ambiguity is gone. They have to choose. Actually choose. Not maintain comfortable in-between state where they get benefits of relationship without requirements of relationship. This forced choice is terrifying because choosing means committing, and committing means vulnerability. But forced choice is also addictive because their real self, beneath defenses, is exhausted by ambiguity, is tired of living in in-between state, wants someone strong enough to force actual choice that eliminates the defended middle ground. The addiction comes from encountering someone who won't let them hide in ambiguity, which means they either have to fully commit or fully leave. And having to make that choice reaches the part of them that's been waiting for someone to require the choice, rather than accepting the defended in between. The immediate follow-through proves someone finally won't absorb the impact of their patterns, forcing them to experience consequences that words never conveyed. Throughout their life, avoidants have encountered people who state boundaries but don't enforce them, who explain consequences but don't implement them, who absorb the impact of avoidant patterns while avoidant remains protected from experiencing impact. This has taught their system that patterns are sustainable. Other people suffer the consequences while they remain comfortable, but encountering someone who enforces boundaries immediately changes this equation. When they withdraw without communicating, and you immediately create 3-day distance as stated consequence, they experience the impact of their pattern directly. They're the one sitting with loneliness their withdrawal created. They're the one feeling anxiety from your absence. They're the one confronting that their pattern produced real consequence they have to sit with, rather than consequence you absorbed while they remain comfortable. This direct experience of consequences is terrifying, but it's also addictive, because their wounded self has been waiting for someone who won't absorb the impact, someone strong enough to let consequences land on them so they finally have to feel what their patterns create. The addiction is to experiencing consequences, which paradoxically feels more like being cared about than being protected from consequences ever did. Because consequences that land proves someone cares enough about themselves not to sacrifice themselves to your patterns. And that self-protection is more attractive to the avoidance real self than endless accommodation ever could be. The uncomfortable mirror turn, what your communication style reveals about you. But here's the question you need to sit with while you're reading about how powerful this communication style is. Why didn't you communicate this way from the beginning? Why did you spend months or years being soft and diplomatic and accommodating before you finally started being direct and boundaried? Because if this communication style is so powerful, if it's what actually reaches avoidance, if it's what creates the only dynamic where they might actually change, why wasn't this how you showed up from day one? The answer reveals something uncomfortable. You were afraid. Afraid that direct communication would push them away. Afraid that clear boundaries would be too much for their wounded system. Afraid that enforcing consequences immediately would make you seem harsh or uncaring. So, you accommodated, you softened, you cushioned your needs in language designed not to trigger their defenses, and in doing so, you taught them your boundaries weren't real, taught them your needs were negotiable, taught them they could maintain patterns because you'd absorb the consequences. The communication style that creates addiction in them requires something from you that you weren't willing to give earlier: willingness to lose them. Direct, boundaried communication only works if you're genuinely prepared for them to choose their patterns over choosing you. If you're communicating this way as strategy to make them change while secretly being unwilling to enforce consequences, if they don't change, they'll sense it and the communication loses all power. The addiction to this communication style only develops when they encounter someone who's genuinely indifferent to which choice they make, genuinely okay with them leaving if they can't meet stated needs. Your earlier soft communication revealed you weren't okay with them leaving, revealed you'd rather accommodate than enforce boundaries that might cost you the relationship. And that accommodation is what taught them they didn't have to change. So before you celebrate having found the communication style that hooks avoidance, ask yourself, why did it take you so long to communicate this way? And are you communicating this way now because you've genuinely become willing to lose them, or because you're desperate and this is last-ditch strategy before you give up? Because if it's strategy rather than genuine boundary enforcement from place of self-worth, it won't create the addiction. It'll just be more manipulation they'll eventually see through. The power is in the genuine willingness to walk away, not in the communication style itself. Why the addiction? Doesn't mean they're capable of meeting what the communication requires. The avoidant getting addicted to someone who communicates with clean boundaries is real and observable. But addiction to communication style is different from capacity to meet what the communication requires. And confusing these creates hope that sets you up for disappointment. The addiction is to how the communication makes them feel, not to doing the work the communication requires. They're addicted to the clarity, to the realness, to the moments where they can't hide, to the feeling of being with someone strong enough to enforce boundaries. This addiction creates desire, creates longing, creates obsessive thinking about the person who communicates this way. But desire isn't capability. Longing isn't capacity. They desperately want the person who won't tolerate their patterns, and they remain completely incapable of changing the patterns that person won't tolerate. The addiction and the incapacity coexist. Both are real. They want you more than they've wanted anyone precisely because you won't accept their patterns. And they're exactly as defended against changing their patterns as they've always been, because defensive structure isn't altered by desire. The addiction makes them want access to you. It doesn't make them able to be the person who deserves access to you. This gap between desperately wanting someone and being incapable of meeting that someone's requirements is what creates the avoidance suffering. but their suffering doesn't create your obligation to accept them despite incapacity. They often respond to clear boundaries with promises rather than sustained change behavior, confusing crisis-driven acknowledgement with genuine transformation. When you communicate clearly and enforce boundaries immediately, avoidant often responds dramatically, acknowledges patterns, expresses insight about their wounds, promises change, seems different in moment of crisis when they're facing losing you. This crisis response looks like change, feels like breakthrough, creates hope that direct communication worked, that they're finally getting it, that transformation is beginning. But crisis-driven acknowledgement is different from sustained behavioral change. Crisis makes them desperate. Desperation creates promises, but desperation isn't transformation. Once crisis passes, once you accept them back, once they feel secure again, once fear of loss diminishes, the promises fade and patterns return, because the patterns are driven by nervous system programming that crisis doesn't reprogram. They meant the promises in moment of crisis, and the patterns return anyway, because wanting to change and being able to change are different things. The communication style creates crisis that produces promises. It doesn't create capacity that produces sustained transformation. Understanding this protects you from accepting promises as evidence of change when only sustained change behavior over significant time is actual evidence of transformation. The addiction can make them more desperate rather than more healthy, creating intensity that feels like progress but is actually their defended system fighting harder to maintain access without actually changing. Sometimes the addiction to a person who communicates with clear boundaries makes avoidant more intense rather than more healthy, more pursuing, more expressive about feelings, more seemingly engaged. This intensity feels like progress, feels like they're finally showing up. But intensity can be defended systems' way of maintaining access to a person they're addicted to without doing actual vulnerable work of transformation. They can pursue intensely while remaining emotionally defended, can express feelings dramatically while not actually being vulnerable, can seem engaged while maintaining fundamental walls that prevent real intimacy. The intensity is performance, sometimes conscious manipulation, sometimes unconscious desperate attempt to keep person they're addicted to without having to change patterns that would cost them the defended position they need. Intensity isn't vulnerability. Drama isn't intimacy. Desperate pursuit isn't secure attachment. The addiction can create all the appearance of change through increased intensity while actual defensive structure remains completely intact. This is why intensity and avoidant should be treated with suspicion rather than hope. Real change is quiet, sustained, behavioral. Dramatic intensity is often defended systems' last attempt to maintain access without transformation. What communicating this way actually accomplishes and what it costs you. Understanding both the power of this communication style and its costs helps you decide whether deploying it serves your actual well-being or just creates different form of being drained by someone who can't meet your needs. The communication creates clarity about their capacity, forcing them to demonstrate through choices whether they can meet your needs rather than keeping you hoping through words. The power of direct boundaried communication is diagnostic. It eliminates ambiguity. It forces avoidant to demonstrate capacity through behavior rather than maintain hope through promises. I need weekly therapy attendance and visible progress on emotional availability. Show me 3 months of this, or I'm done. Now you'll know. Either they do it, attend therapy, demonstrate progress, meet stated need, or they don't. Their choice reveals capacity. If they meet the need, you have evidence capacity exists. If they don't meet the need, you have clarity They're incapable regardless of how much they claim to want you. This clarity is valuable. It eliminates months or years of hoping and waiting and believing potential instead of accepting demonstrated reality. The communication accelerates the timeline. You'll know within stated time frame whether they're capable or not. This knowledge serves you by preventing wasted time on someone whose promises will never convert to sustained behavior change. But the communication requires you to actually enforce stated consequences, and enforcement often costs the relationship you're trying to save. The cost of this communication style is that it only works if you enforce. If you state boundary and consequence, and then don't enforce when boundary is crossed, you've taught them your boundaries are performance. Next boundary you state will have zero power because they learned the first boundary was empty. This means you have to actually be willing to enforce, have to actually leave when you say you'll leave, have to actually create stated distance when pattern continues. And enforcement often means losing the relationship. They might not meet the need, might not change the pattern, might choose their defended comfort over meeting your requirement. And when they make that choice, enforcement means you leave permanently. The communication style that's designed to create change in the relationship often results in ending the relationship because it forces truth. Either they're capable of meeting your needs or they're not. And if they're not, you have to leave to maintain integrity of your boundaries. The cost is discovering they're not capable and having to follow through on walking away from someone you're still attached to. This cost is worth it if your goal is clarity and self-protection. This cost is devastating if your goal was keeping the relationship while making them change. The style creates addiction in them, but can create exhaustion in you. Constantly enforcing boundaries with someone who tests them requires energy better spent on someone who respects boundaries naturally. Here's the hidden cost. Enforcing boundaries with someone who's constantly testing them is exhausting. Every boundary requires vigilance. Every stated consequence requires follow-through. Every pattern requires enforcement. You become boundary enforcement machine. And yes, this creates addiction in them. They're obsessed with person they can't manipulate or move. But what are you becoming in the process? You're becoming harder, more vigilant, more focused on enforcement than on building, more organized around their patterns and your responses than on creating life you want. The exhaustion is real, and the exhaustion reveals something important. You deserve someone who respects boundaries without constant enforcement. Someone whose first response to your stated need is, how do I meet that? Not testing to see if the boundary is real. Communicating with clean boundaries is powerful with avoidance, but the power comes at cost of enormous energy expenditure. And that energy might be better spent finding someone who doesn't require this level of boundary enforcement to function in basic relationship. The addiction you create in them might not be worth the exhaustion you create in yourself. The 3 outcomes that result from communicating this way and why only one actually serves you. Direct boundaried communication with avoidant produces one of 3 outcomes. Understanding all 3 helps you recognize which outcome is actually occurring and whether continuing makes sense. Outcome 1, they rise to meet your boundaries and sustain changed behavior over time, the rarest outcome that requires genuine therapeutic work on their part. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the direct communication combined with enforced boundaries creates enough crisis that avoidant genuinely commits to therapeutic work, gets therapist who specializes in attachment, does the work consistently, demonstrates sustained behavioral change over months and years. Patterns shift, capacity develops. The relationship transforms into something functional where your needs are met and their patterns are addressed through ongoing therapeutic process. This outcome is possible. It's also rare, very rare. It requires avoidant who's hit bottom hard enough to choose years of uncomfortable growth work over losing you. It requires sustained commitment through therapeutic process that often gets worse before it gets better. It requires nervous system reprogramming that takes time and doesn't happen through willpower or desire. This outcome is what people hope for when they start communicating with clean boundaries. And it's rare enough that betting on it is usually betting wrong. If this outcome happens, you'll know through sustained change behavior over significant time, not through promises or intensity or dramatic acknowledgement. Only actual sustained change proves this outcome is occurring. Outcome 2, they can't meet boundaries and you leave, getting clarity about their incapacity and protecting yourself from further harm. More commonly, the direct communication and enforced boundaries reveal they can't meet stated needs. They try briefly, fail, revert to patterns, or they don't try at all, choose patterns, demonstrate incapacity through their choices. When this happens, and you enforce stated consequence by leaving, you've achieved clarity. You know they're incapable. You know staying would mean accepting patterns you already determined you won't accept. You protected yourself by leaving someone who demonstrated they can't meet your needs. This outcome serves you. Not emotionally. Leaving someone you're attached to is painful, regardless of how clear you are they can't meet your needs. But it serves you by preventing years of wasted time hoping someone will become capable when they've demonstrated they're not. This outcome is success, even though it feels like loss. You gained clarity, you protected yourself, you enforced boundaries that maintain your integrity. The relationship ended, but your self-respect increased. This outcome, as painful as it is actually a good outcome because it serves your well-being by removing you from a situation that wasn't serving you. Outcome 3, they partially comply enough to keep you while not actually transforming. The worst outcome that keeps you trapped in improved but still insufficient dynamic. The dangerous outcome is the middle one. They respond to your boundaries by partially changing. They improve just enough that leaving feels unjustified. They meet some needs while failing to meet others. They do some work while not doing enough work. They create just enough change that you stay, while not creating sufficient change that relationship becomes functional. This partial compliance is trap. It's better than it was, which makes staying feel reasonable. But it's not good enough to actually meet your needs, which means you're still being drained and still accepting insufficient treatment. You're stuck in constantly enforcing boundaries that are partially respected, constantly requiring effort to maintain standards that are partially met, constantly exhausted by managing someone who's trying just hard enough to keep you, but not trying hard enough to actually transform into partner who doesn't require constant management. This outcome is worst because it keeps you trapped. You can't justify leaving because there's improvement. But you can't be fulfilled because improvement is insufficient. You stay in a relationship that's improved but still inadequate indefinitely, organizing your life around enforcement and management instead of building with someone whose capacity matches your needs from the beginning. This outcome is what drains people for years. And recognizing when you're in this outcome, when partial compliance is keeping you trapped in an insufficient relationship, is crucial for deciding to leave even though they're trying. The final recognition about what this communication style actually means for your freedom. Understanding the power of direct boundaried communication with avoidance and understanding whether deploying it serves you are different questions. The final recognition determines which matters more. The communication style is powerful, but using it keeps you engaged with someone who requires this level of management, and engagement with someone who requires constant boundary enforcement is opposite of freedom. Yes, this communication style works. Yes, it creates addiction and avoidance. Yes, it's more effective than soft diplomatic communication at reaching them and forcing choice about capacity. All of this is true, and all of it requires you to remain engaged with someone who needs this level of clear boundary enforcement to function in relationship. Think about what that means. You're spending energy on constant enforcement, constant vigilance about whether boundaries are being respected, constant follow-through on consequences when boundaries are crossed. This engagement, however powerful it is opposite of freedom. Freedom is being with someone who respects boundaries without constant enforcement. Someone whose first instinct when you state need is meeting the need, not testing whether the boundary is real. Someone who doesn't require management through clear consequence enforcement to function in basic partnership. The power of this communication style with avoidance is real, and the power might be evidence you should leave rather than evidence you found a way to make it work. Because if someone requires this level of boundary enforcement to maybe possibly potentially become capable of meeting your needs, maybe they're not the person whose capacity matches what you deserve. You deserve someone who doesn't require addiction to your boundary enforcement to stay engaged. Someone who chooses you from place of health rather than from place of desperate need to access what their defenses usually destroy. The avoidance addiction to person who communicates with clean boundaries is real. But the addiction comes from place of desperation, not health. They're addicted because you're the immovable object their patterns can't move. They're addicted because you force clarity they usually avoid. They're addicted because you create crisis that penetrates their defended fog. This addiction isn't healthy attachment. It's desperate need to access something their system usually destroys, combined with inability to stop destroying it, even while desperately needing it. You deserve better than being someone's addiction. You deserve someone who chooses you from secure place. Someone who wants partnership with you because partnership feels good, not because partnership with you forces them to confront themselves in ways that feel terrible but compelling. Someone whose engagement with you comes from health rather than from desperate attachment to person who won't tolerate their patterns. The addiction is flattering. The addiction is compelling. The addiction is also a sign that dynamic is driven by their defended system's response to your strength rather than by genuine, healthy, secure choosing of you as person they want to build with. The most powerful thing isn't learning to communicate in ways that hook avoidance. It's learning to communicate in ways that filter avoidance out before attachment develops. Here's the final recognition. The communication style that creates addiction and avoidance is powerful, and the most powerful use of that communication style isn't deploying it with avoidant you're already attached to in hopes of making them change. The most powerful use is deploying it from the beginning with everyone you meet, communicating with such clean, direct boundaries from day one that avoidants either rise to meet them immediately or filter themselves out before you become attached. I need consistency and emotional availability. I don't do hot and cold. I enforce boundaries immediately when they're crossed. This is information about what relationship with me requires. State this early, before attachment, before hope, before you've invested enough to make leaving painful, and watch what happens. Healthy people hear this and think, that sounds like reasonable requirements for functional relationship. Avoidants hear this and either commit to meeting it from the beginning or leave because they know they can't sustain it. Either outcome serves you. Either you get someone who meets stated needs from the start, or someone who can't meet them filters themselves out early before you've wasted time hoping they'll become capable. The power isn't in using this communication to change someone. The power is in using this communication to filter for people who don't need to be changed. That's freedom. That's the actual power of direct boundaried communication. Not making avoidance addicted to you, making yourself unavailable to anyone who can't meet clearly stated needs from the beginning. Use the communication style as filter, not as fix. That's when it actually serves your freedom, instead of just creating different form of being drained by someone who requires constant management to maybe possibly function in relationship that still might not meet your needs. The most powerful thing isn't learning to communicate in ways that hook avoidance. It's learning to communicate in ways that filter avoidance out before attachment develops. Here's the final recognition. The communication style that creates addiction and avoidance is powerful. And the most powerful use of that communication style isn't deploying it with avoidant you're already attached to in hopes of making them change. The most powerful use is deploying it from the beginning with everyone you meet, communicating with such clean, direct boundaries from day one that avoidants either rise to meet them immediately or filter themselves out before you become attached. I need consistency and emotional availability. I don't do hot and cold. I enforce boundaries immediately when they're crossed. This is the information about what relationship with me requires. State this early, before attachment, before hope, before you've invested enough to make leaving painful, and watch what happens. Healthy people hear this and think, that sounds like reasonable requirements for functional relationship. Avoidants hear this and either commit to meeting it from the beginning or leave because they know they can't sustain it. Either outcome serves you. Either you get someone who meets stated needs from the start, or someone who can't meet them, filters themselves out early, before you've wasted time hoping they'll become capable. The power isn't in using this communication to change someone. The power is in using this communication to filter for people who don't need to be changed. That's freedom. That's the actual power of direct boundaried communication. Not making avoidance addicted to you. Making yourself unavailable to anyone who can't meet clearly stated needs from the beginning. Use the communication style as filter, not as fix. That's when it actually serves your freedom, instead of just creating different form of being drained by someone who requires constant management to maybe possibly function in relationship that still might not meet your needs. Why the addiction they develop actually validates everything you already knew about your worth. The avoidant becoming addicted to someone who communicates with unshakable boundaries isn't just interesting psychological phenomenon. It's confirmation of something you always suspected, but were taught to doubt. Their addiction proves that what you called too much about yourself was actually the strength they couldn't handle. Throughout the relationship, your clarity probably got labeled as too demanding, your boundaries as too rigid, your standards as too high, your emotional honesty as too intense. They made you feel like your way of communicating, direct, clear, boundaried, was the problem. Like you needed to soften, accommodate, make yourself more palatable to their defended system. And maybe you did soften. Maybe you spent months or years making yourself smaller, communicating in ways that wouldn't trigger them, accepting less than you needed because you believed the problem was your expectations being too much. But their addiction to you, once you stopped accommodating and started communicating with full clarity, proves something. What they called too much was actually the strength that reaches them in ways nothing else can. Your directness isn't too much. It's the only thing clear enough to cut through their defended fog. Your boundaries aren't too rigid. They're the only thing solid enough that their testing can't move them. Your standards aren't too high. They're the appropriate level that someone with self-worth maintains. Everything they made you feel was too much about you is exactly what creates the addiction once you stop apologizing for it and start enforcing it. The addiction is validation. You weren't too much. You were exactly right. For someone whose capacity matched yours. They just weren't that someone. The fact that they want you more when you're less available proves you were always more valuable than they treated you. The pattern is revealing. When you were available, accommodating, adjusting yourself to their limitations, they took you for granted, didn't prioritize you, didn't fight for the relationship, didn't demonstrate that you mattered enough to change patterns for. But the moment you became less available, the moment you enforced boundaries that made access to you conditional on meeting your needs, suddenly you became the most important thing in their world. Suddenly, they're pursuing. Suddenly, they're thinking about you constantly. Suddenly, they're desperate to keep what they're losing. This pattern proves something crucial. You were always this valuable. Your worth didn't increase when you became less available. Your worth was always this high. What changed is their perception of whether they could take you for granted. When you were accommodating, they treated you as guaranteed. When you enforced boundaries, they suddenly saw you as possibly losing you, and the possible loss made them recognize value that was there all along, but they couldn't see while they were taking it for granted. This recognition that you were always this valuable, and they just couldn't see it while you were available, is liberating. It means the problem was never your worth. The problem was their inability to recognize worth while possessing access to it. And that inability is their limitation, not your insufficiency. Their desperate need for what they can't manipulate reveals that you threatening to leave isn't you being cruel. It's you finally loving yourself as much as you love them. When you communicate clearly and enforce boundaries and make access to you conditional on respectful treatment, they might accuse you of being harsh, unforgiving, giving up too easily, not understanding their wounds, being unwilling to work on the relationship. These accusations are designed to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself, designed to frame your boundaries as you being the problem. But their desperate addiction to you once you enforce those boundaries reveals the truth. You're not being cruel. You're finally treating yourself with the love and protection you were giving them while accepting scraps in return. You love them enough to be patient for months or years. You love them enough to accommodate their patterns. You love them enough to make yourself smaller so they could stay comfortable. Now you're finally loving yourself that much. Finally giving yourself the patience and protection you were giving them. Finally making your needs as important as you made their comfort. The boundaries aren't cruelty. The boundaries are you finally applying to yourself the love you were pouring into someone who couldn't receive it. And their addiction to you, once you start loving yourself this way, proves that strength is more attractive than accommodation ever was. They want you more when you're protecting yourself than they ever wanted you when you were sacrificing yourself. That's the lesson. Not that boundaries are manipulation tactic. That boundaries are self-love made visible, and self-love is more compelling than self-sacrifice could ever be. The permanent shift that occurs in you once you discover this communication style's power, learning that direct boundaried communication creates addiction and avoidance, while soft accommodation creates contempt, doesn't just change how you communicate with current person, it fundamentally alters how you'll show up in every relationship going forward. You'll never be able to go back to soft, accommodating communication now that you've seen what clear boundaries create. Once you've experienced the shift, once you've witnessed how someone who took you for granted suddenly becomes addicted when you start enforcing clear boundaries, you can't unknow what that taught you. You can't go back to believing that accommodation and patience and softness are what create healthy relationships. You've seen evidence that the opposite is true, that strength creates respect, that boundaries create desire, that clarity creates engagement. This knowledge changes you permanently. In every future relationship, you'll know that if you have to soften yourself or accommodate patterns or make yourself smaller to keep someone, you're with wrong person. You'll know that right person responds to your full strength with appreciation, not with needing you to diminish yourself. You'll communicate with clean boundaries from the beginning because you've learned that's how you filter for people who can meet you, not how you change people who can't. The softness that didn't serve you with avoidant won't be available to offer anyone in future who can't handle your strength. You've changed. The accommodation died when you discovered what enforcement creates, and that death serves your future even if it came too late to save the past. You've learned that being addictive to someone isn't the same as being valued by someone, and this distinction will protect you from confusing intensity with intimacy. The avoidant is addicted to you, obsessed with you, thinking about you constantly, pursuing you in ways they never did when you were available. This intensity is compelling, feels like finally mattering, feels like proof they love you. But you've learned, or you're learning, that addiction isn't love. Intensity isn't intimacy. Being obsessed with someone isn't the same as valuing them. They're addicted to you because you're triggering their nervous system in specific ways, because you're creating crisis, because you're the immovable object their defended system can't move. This addiction creates intensity, but intensity without capacity is just drama, just emotional chaos, just two nervous systems creating compelling dysfunction. Real love is quieter. Real value is demonstrated through sustained respectful treatment, not through desperate pursuit when they're losing you. Real intimacy is built through consistent presence, not through hot pursuit, followed by cold withdrawal, followed by a desperate return. You've learned the difference between being someone's addiction and being someone's choice, between creating intensity through enforcement and receiving care through partnership. This learning will protect you in future from mistaking someone's desperate need to access you for someone's genuine appreciation of you. Addiction and value look similar from distance. Up close, only one is sustainable. Only one is actually love. The power you've discovered in your communication isn't about them. It's about you, finally becoming someone who won't abandon yourself for anyone's comfort. Here's what actually happened when you started communicating with clean, direct boundaries. You stopped abandoning yourself. You stopped making your needs smaller than theirs. You stopped accepting treatment you didn't want to accept. You stopped performing endless patience while your actual needs went unmet. You stopped betraying yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And this stopping, this refusal to abandon yourself anymore, is what created the shift. Not the specific words you used, not the technique of boundary enforcement. The shift came from you finally choosing yourself, finally making your well-being more important than their comfort, finally being willing to lose them rather than lose yourself. This is the power, not in the communication style itself, but in what the communication style represents. You becoming person who won't betray yourself for anyone. This version of you, the one who enforces boundaries immediately, who states needs clearly, who walks away when needs aren't met, this version is who you always should have been. The version who accommodated and softened and made yourself smaller was betrayal of yourself. You've stopped betraying yourself. That's the shift. That's the power. And that power serves every area of your life, not just your relationship with avoidant, who may or may not be capable of rising to meet it. You've become someone who won't abandon yourself. That's worth more than any relationship. That's the freedom the communication style actually created. The final truth about what their addiction actually means for your future. They're addicted to communication style that won't tolerate their patterns. This addiction is real, is consuming, is restructuring their entire psychology around wanting access to you. And here's what that means for your future. Absolutely nothing unless they do sustain therapeutic work to develop capacity to meet what the communication requires. Their addiction is interesting. Their suffering is appropriate. Their desperate desire for you is confirmation you are always valuable, and none of it changes the fundamental question: can they actually meet your needs? Can they sustain emotional availability? Can they maintain consistency? Can they be vulnerable? Can they stop withdrawing? Can they build partnership instead of defended distance? The addiction doesn't answer these questions. Only sustained, changed behavior over significant time answers them. And if the answer is no, if they can't meet your needs regardless of how desperately they want you, then their addiction is irrelevant to your future. It's just interesting information about their psychology that doesn't obligate you to stay with someone who can't give you what you need. Let them be addicted. Let them suffer from wanting what they can't have. Let them organize their entire psychology around desperate need for a person who won't tolerate their patterns. All of that can be true, and you can still leave, can still build life with someone who doesn't need addiction to clear boundaries to stay engaged, can still choose partnership with someone who meets your needs from place of health rather than from place of desperate compulsion created by your enforcement. Their addiction proves you are always worth more than they gave you. Your leaving proves you finally know it. Both are happening. Only one determines your future. Choose the one that serves your freedom over the one that flatters your ego. Choose building with someone whose capacity matches your worth over managing someone whose addiction to your strength doesn't translate to ability to honor it. That's the path forward. That's what their addiction to your communication style actually teaches. Not that you found the key to making them change, that you found your power, and your power deserves to be spent on someone who doesn't require constant enforcement to function in basic partnership. Someone who hears your clear, direct boundaries and thinks, finally, someone who knows what they need and asks for it clearly, rather than someone who hears those same boundaries and becomes addicted to what they can't manipulate. You deserve the former. The latter is just an interesting phenomenon you happen to create on your way to finding someone better. Let the addiction be their education. Let your clarity be your liberation. And build something extraordinary with the version of yourself who finally stopped abandoning yourself for anyone's comfort. That version of you deserves partner who's already healthy, not partner who might become healthy if their addiction to your boundaries is strong enough to motivate transformation that probably won't occur. Choose accordingly.